So, imagine for a second that you are an engineer.
Okay. I'm with.
You're not building like a bridge or a software app or something. Your task is to design the operating system for a highly advanced apex predator species.
Wow. Okay, that is a pretty massive design brief.
Right. And you want this species to survive in brutal, unforgiving environments. You want them to build these sprawling civilizations and coordinate highly complex actions across millions of individual units.
So from a purely mechanistic perspective, if I'm at that drafting table, the only logical blueprint is to hardwire them to prioritize cold, hard data.
Exactly. You'd want them to run on spreadsheets, on
Um,
pure logic.
Right, because survival is essentially a straightforward math problem.
Yeah, just calories in versus calories expended.
Threat probability calculations, structural integrity of shelters. Any deviation from objective reality would theoretically introduce fatal errors into that system.
But then you look at humans.
Yeah, and that perfectly logical blueprint just goes entirely out the window.
Completely. We are a species that dominates the planet, yet we spend this massive, almost inexplicable amount of our metabolic energy doing something completely illogical.
We just hallucinate fictions together.
We really do. I mean, think about the last time you, the listener, binged television show until like 3 in the morning.
Oh yeah, we've all been there.
Your heart was racing, your palms were sweating, maybe your adrenal glands were pumping. But why? Your physical body was sitting completely safe on a comfortable piece of furniture, just staring at glowing pixels on a piece of glass.
Yet your brain was running a full-blown physiological simulation of danger or heartbreak or triumph.
Exactly. We obsess over myths. We tell each other elaborate tales around the water cooler. We spend literal billions of dollars to sit in dark rooms and watch projected light tell us made-up stories.
And that brings us to the mission of our deep dive today.
Yes, it does. We are stepping into a stack of research today that fundamentally shifts how we view all of this.
Because this isn't just entertainment.
No.
It's not just leisure or some evolutionary byproduct of having a slightly overgrown frontal cortex. The literature we're looking at is showing us something quite definitive and honestly a bit staggering.
Storytelling is a hardcore biological survival technology.
It is the literal software that runs human hardware.
So our goal today for you listening is to unpack all of this. First, we want to understand exactly what your brain is doing when processing a story. Then we're going to uncover why narratives absolutely crush raw data when it comes to changing human behavior.
Right, and then we'll explore how this applies to modern education, civic engagement, and identity formation.
And finally, we're going to deliver 3 concrete, actionable design rules you can use right now when building curriculums or tools or stories.
So when we start looking under the hood at the neurobiology and the evolutionary psychology, we realize that we are quite literally wired for story.
Okay, let's unpack this, because if stories are this potent at hacking the individual brain, we have to start by looking at the actual biological mechanisms.
We do.
Like, if I am sitting on my couch reading a paperback novel about, I don't know, a detective in 1920s London, what is my physical brain actually doing?
Well, it's a great question because a biological machine shouldn't technically care about a ghost story or a murder mystery that never happened.
Right, it wastes calories.
Exactly. But to understand why the brain cares so deeply, we have to look at 2 core cognitive faculties that developed in our ancestors.
The ones the researchers call mental time travel and theory of mind.
Yes, MTT and Tom.
Oh.
These are the twin engines of narrative cognition.
Now, mental time travel sounds like a concept pulled straight from a sci-fi novel.
It really does.
But in the cognitive psychology papers we reviewed, it's treated as a very specific, measurable mechanical function.
Right. It is a formal, highly resource-intensive cognitive process.
So what does it actually look like?
Well, mental time travel refers to the human brain's ability to completely detach from the present moment, to literally unplug from the immediate sensory environment of the here and now.
So you stop paying attention to the couch you're sitting on.
Exactly. And you project yourself either backward into episodic memory or forward to simulate future scenarios.
It's the capacity to ask, what if?
But it doesn't work in isolation.
Yeah.
You have to couple mental time travel with theory of mind.
Theory of mind. That's the cognitive ability to attribute complex mental states to others, right?
Yes, it is the deep fundamental understanding that the person standing across from you has beliefs, desires, intentions, and hidden knowledge that are entirely different from your own.
Okay, so if I'm tracking the mechanics of this to even process the most basic primitive story.
Something like the hunter went over the mountain because he thought there was a herd of deer on the other side,
Yeah, perfectly simple story. To process that, I have to be able to leave my current physical reality. I have to imagine a mountain I am not currently standing on.
which is the mental time travel part,
Right. And then, crucially, I have to simulate the internal invisible desire of a hunter who is not me.
which is the theory of mind. And that is the exact computational load required.
It sounds exhausting for a brain.
It is incredibly taxing. And what functional MRI studies, the fMRI scans, reveal about this process is fascinating.
Because the brain doesn't neatly separate fiction from reality when it runs these simulations, does it?
Not at all. It uses the exact same hardware for both.
This blew my mind in the sources.
Yeah. When researchers put subjects in an fMRI machine and have them read narrative fiction, the results are incredibly literal.
So if you read a sentence about a character tightly grasping a physical object like a sword or a doorknob.
The motor cortex in your own brain lights up.
Wait, really? The actual neuron?
The exact neurons responsible for moving your actual hand begin to fire.
That is wild.
Gets deeper. When you read about a character experiencing a complex social emotion like profound shame or joy, your brain's mirror neuron system activates.
These are the exact same neural circuits that engage during real-life social interactions, right?
Yes, and real-life problem solving.
So the brain is essentially treating the fiction as a lived experience. It's firing the same neurons it would if you were actually out there doing the thing or feeling the emotion.
Precisely.
But why? I keep coming back to the biology. Why spend the glucose, the actual physical metabolic energy, to fire those networks for a fake scenario?
Well, it comes down to a survival mechanism called symbolic compression, which relies on something called working memory gating.
Working memory gating. Okay, let's break that down.
The brain is constantly trying to manage its cognitive workload because raw data in complex systems are incredibly expensive to process.
Right, if you try to take in every single piece of sensory data in a crowded room, your brain would overheat and shut down.
It would crash. So the brain uses the basal ganglia essentially as a highly selective bouncer at a nightclub.
Oh, I love that visual. So the basal ganglia is standing at the velvet rope of the brain, just checking IDs.
Exactly. The basal ganglia decides which sensory inputs and pieces of information get past the velvet rope and into the VIP section.
And the VIP section is the prefrontal cortex.
Your working memory, yes. It filters out the vast majority of irrelevant information.
But even then, complex social dynamics are just too heavy to carry.
So the brain compresses these massive complex sets of ideas into single symbolic objects.
The researchers use this brilliant analogy for this chunking process that I think will really help you, the listener, picture it.
The flag analogy.
Yes. So think about trying to comprehend a nation's entire history.
We're talking hundreds of years of brutal wars, shifting treaties, deep cultural shifts.
Intricate legal codes and the lived experiences of millions of individual citizens.
The human brain simply cannot hold all of that raw data in its working memory at once. It would crash the system.
So what does the brain do? It compresses all of that sprawling, infinite complexity into a single manageable symbol.
A piece of cloth with some colors and patterns on it, a flag.
When you look at that flag, your brain immediately unpacks the emotional resonance and the core meaning of all that history without you having to consciously recite a single historical fact.
And story performs the exact same cognitive function. It compresses impossibly complex human social dynamics into recognizable characters and predictable plot arcs.
Which brings us to the core argument proposed by cognitive psychologists like Keith Oatley and Raymond Marr.
Yes, they frame storytelling as a social flight simulator.
This was the concept that completely shifted my perspective on why we consume fiction.
That's a perfect framing. Think about how a pilot learns to fly a commercial jet.
You definitely do not put a novice pilot in a multi-million-dollar aircraft with hundreds of passengers and just say, hey, go figure out how to handle an engine failure.
The stakes are way too high. One mistake means death.
Right.
Instead, you put them in a flight simulator.
Yeah.
They get to experience the alarm bells, the dropping altitude, the sheer panic, and they get to practice their response.
And if they crash in the simulator, their heart rate spikes, they sweat, their cortisol levels shoot up, but they walk away unharmed.
They have built a physiological and cognitive memory of how to handle the disaster. Humans use fiction in the exact same way.
Because we live in incredibly complex, hyper-connected social webs.
Where misjudging an ally or failing to recognize an enemy could historically mean exile, starvation, or death.
So fiction provides a low-risk simulated laboratory to practice social cognition. We get to, quote, die 1,000 deaths in our imagination so we don't have to in reality.
That's exactly it.
I mean, if you have a teenager at home who is obsessively reading tragic, angsty romance novels, they aren't just wasting time.
Not at all. They are virtually crashing a relationship in a completely safe environment.
They are experiencing the betrayal, the loss, the emotional devastation from the safety of their bedroom.
Building cognitive antibodies against future real-world heartbreak.
And there is empirical, measurable proof that this simulation training works right.
Oh, absolutely. Take the mind and the eyes test.
Right, from the literature.
It's a widely used psychological assessment designed to measure empathy and social intelligence. Participants are shown tightly cropped, black and white photographs of just a person's eyes.
No mouth, no body language, no context.
Exactly. They are then asked to identify the highly complex emotional state of the person just from the micro-expressions around the eyes.
Is this person feeling contemplative, irritated, flirtatious, or despondent?
It's incredibly difficult to do because you're operating on such minimal data.
It is. But what the research consistently and remarkably shows is that people who read narrative fiction,
Specifically literary fiction that focuses on deep character interiority.
they score significantly higher on this test.
They perform markedly better on social intelligence and empathy metrics than those who primarily read nonfiction or those who don't read at all.
They are quite literally working out their empathetic muscles in the gym of fiction.
By constantly simulating the minds of fictional characters, their basal ganglia and mirror neuron systems become hyper-attuned to the subtle cues of human emotion in the real world.
Okay, but wait. Let me push back on this, or at least play devil's advocate for a second. Let's look at the mechanics of this from a purely efficiency standpoint.
Sure.
If the brain is just putting on a VR headset to learn about human psychology, and the ultimate goal is just to understand social dynamics, why wrap it in dragons or strengths battles or medieval romances?
It's a fair point.
I mean, if I want to understand human cognitive dissonance, wouldn't it be vastly more metabolically efficient to just hand me a textbook on behavioral psychology?
Just give you the raw distilled data.
Yeah, cut out the middleman.
That is the logical assumption, but it ignores the fundamental architecture of human cognition. Abstract facts simply do not activate the mirror neuron system.
They don't.
No. When you read a textbook that states humans experience cognitive dissonance when their deeply held beliefs contradict their physical actions, your analytical mind processes the syntax. You understand the definition.
But it remains entirely abstract.
This is what psychologists call paradigmatic thought. It's categorized, filed away, and easily forgotten. Human cognition, however, is not fundamentally paradigmatic. It is agent-based.
We evolved to understand the world through agents, through cause-effect and intention.
Exactly, because in the ancestral environment, the rustle in the bushes wasn't a physics equation about wind velocity.
Right, it was either a tiger that wanted to eat you or a rabbit you could eat.
It was an agent with an intention. So when you read a narrative about a specific character, let's say a deeply religious character who suddenly finds themselves committing a crime to save their child, your mirror neurons fire.
You don't just understand the definition of cognitive dissonance. You feel the physical discomfort of it.
Narrative reasoning embeds the abstract knowledge into an emotional and experiential matrix. It anchors the data to a physical sensation, which makes it stick in long-term memory in a way that abstract data never will.
Think about the implications of this for a moment. If you are listening to this and trying to teach a complex new protocol to your team at work, or if you're a teacher trying to explain the geopolitical causes of a historical war.
Or even if you're just trying to get your partner to understand why you're upset.
Yes. Realizing that your audience's brains are biologically starved for a simulation rather than a spreadsheet completely upends how you communicate.
You cannot just hand them a list of facts.
Because the velvet rope of their basal ganglia will just reject it as irrelevant noise.
You have to put them in the flight simulator. You have to translate the complexity into a narrative format that their brain is biologically evolved to metabolize.
And that biological evolution leads us to a massive question of scale. We've established how deeply this narrative software hacks the individual brain. But how did this internal mechanism scale up?
How did a bunch of hacked individual brains sitting around a campfire translate into physical evolutionary survival for the group?
Because, as we noted, storytelling is what evolutionary biologists explicitly label a costly behavior.
In the brutal calculus of natural selection, calories are everything.
Right. If you are sitting around a fire for 3 hours making up myths about the stars, you are burning calories. You are not foraging for berries, you are not hunting, and you are not reinforcing your shelter.
If storytelling didn't provide an immediate massive return on investment for physical survival, natural selection would have ruthlessly pruned it out of our behavioral repertoire thousands of years ago.
Yet instead of pruning it, evolution amplified it.
The evolutionary psychology literature highlights narrative not as an accident, but as a primary driver of human fitness.
And to understand why we need to look at the Agda hunter-gatherer study.
The study by Daniel Smith and his colleagues in the Philippines. This was one of the most compelling pieces of empirical data in our entire stack of sources.
I couldn't agree more. Break down the methodology for us because it makes it so powerful.
So the researchers spent time with camps of Agda hunter-gatherers, observing populations that still live in an environment and social structure closely resembling our ancestral past.
But they didn't just passively observe, right?
No, they meticulously tracked the social dynamics. They identified who the skilled storytellers were within these specific camps.
And then they ran controlled resource sharing games.
Basically, they gave individuals tokens that represented valuable resources like rice. And they tracked how often people chose to keep the resources for themselves versus giving them to their campmates.
What they found totally dismantles the stereotype of the alpha male survivalist carrying the tribe on his back.
Completely. They found that camps with a higher proportion of skilled storytellers exhibited significantly more cooperative behavior in these resource-sharing games.
The camps with good storytellers were simply better at sharing and surviving together.
Because the stories these individuals told weren't just idle entertainment, they were functional tools.
The narratives encoded deep social norms regarding egalitarianism, cooperation, the punishment of free riders, and gender equality.
The storytellers were manufacturing the social glue.
But the individual payoff for the storytellers themselves is what really caught my attention. I mean, if you are the one telling the stories, what do you get out of it, biologically speaking?
You get a massive reproductive advantage.
Wow.
The data showed that skilled storytellers were nearly twice as likely to be chosen as preferred social partners, compared to individuals who only had reputations for being excellent hunters or skilled fishers.
People wanted to be around the storytellers more than they wanted to be around the guys bringing in the most meat.
And, crucially, this translated into hard biological fitness. These storytellers had a higher number of surviving offspring.
Because the community actively rewarded them.
The group recognized the immense value of the cohesion the storyteller provided, so they extended help in the form of communal childcare, extra food sharing, and protection to the families of those individuals.
The storyteller is literally out-surviving the apex hunter because the group recognizes that a unified cooperative tribe of average hunters will easily out-survive a fractured tribe with one genius hunter.
Exactly right.
But we have to ask how the story achieves this cooperation. I mean, if a leader stands up in a camp and just issues a mandate like, you must share your food with the sick people, might argue, they might feel resentful.
But if that same leader tells a myth about a greedy hunter who was cursed by the forest spirits, the reaction is entirely different.
So how does the narrative format bypass our natural human skepticism?
The mechanism at work there is known in the psychological literature as narrative transportation. It's been extensively studied by researchers like Green and Brock.
Narrative transportation.
It describes the physiological and cognitive state of being deeply immersed in a story. When you are transported into a narrative world, you experience a significant measurable reduction in a cognitive process called counter-arguing.
Counter-arguing is that cynical voice in the back of your head, right?
Exactly.
Like if I'm watching a political debate, my counter-arguing engine is running at maximum capacity. Every time a candidate speaks, my brain is saying, well, actually that statistic seems cherry-picked, or that policy completely ignores the secondary economic effects.
Right. When you are presented with an abstract argument, raw data, or a direct command, your critical firewall instantly goes up.
You actively evaluate the incoming claims for truth or falsehood, for threat or safety.
But when you are transported by a narrative that critical firewall lowers, you don't immediately evaluate the logistics of the story. You simply experience the chronological flow of it.
You align your emotional state with the protagonist.
This makes narrative an incredibly highly persuasive vehicle, especially for skeptical or resistant audiences, because it delivers the moral or behavioral message completely under the radar of our analytical defenses.
Because raw data might inform us, but it inherently lacks moral direction. You can look at a spreadsheet of food shortages, but the spreadsheet doesn't compel you to share your own food.
The research from moral psychologists like Jonathan Haidt argues that human moral reasoning is largely intuitive and emotionally driven.
We like to think of ourselves as logical calculators weighing ethical pros and cons.
But in reality, our emotions make a split-second decision, and our logical brain scrambles to justify it after the fact. Myths and stories encode values by grabbing those deep, intuitive emotional levers directly.
And beyond moral values, it is vital to understand that stories historically encoded raw, literal survival data.
This is where the concept of traditional ecological knowledge or tech comes in.
For tens of thousands of years, foragers did not survive brutal winters or devastating droughts by referencing PDF manuals or written encyclopedias.
They use storytelling as a highly sophisticated, high-fidelity information technology.
The examples of tech from the sources are stunning because they reveal how deeply practical these ancient myths were.
Let's talk about the indigenous stories of the Three Sisters.
Yes, corn beans and squash. To an outsider, it sounds like a charming, animistic myth about three plant spirits who are sisters and love each other so much they must always be planted together.
But when you look at the agricultural science, the myth is actually a precise, highly optimized agronomic blueprint. It's teaching mutualism.
Let's break that down because it's brilliant. The corn provides a physical stalk for the beans to climb.
And the beans contain bacteria on their roots that fix nitrogen from the air into the soil, acting as a natural fertilizer for the heavy-feeding corn.
And the squash spreads its large, prickly leaves across the ground, retaining soil moisture and deterring pests.
Furthermore, when eaten together, those three plants provide a complete profile of essential amino acids.
The story isn't just a metaphor. It's a survival algorithm wrapped in a narrative to ensure it gets remembered and passed down perfectly from generation to generation.
Or consider how zoological data was encoded. Anthropologists have documented stories that on the surface seem to just be mimicking animal behaviors or sounds.
But upon closer analysis, they are tracking vital data.
A story might hinge on the specific peculiar twitch of a kangaroo's ear.
That detail is preserved in the narrative so that a young hunter learns exactly what micro-movement signals that the animal is about to bolt,
Maximizing the chance of a successful hunt.
But the most sweeping, mind-bending example of this has to be the Aboriginal Australian songlines.
Oh, absolutely. We are talking about musical cartography on a continental scale.
The songlines are one of the most profound examples of narrative as survival tech.
The Australian outback is a vast, often featureless, and incredibly brutal environment. Navigating it requires an immense amount of spatial memory.
And the songlines are these vast narrative pathways that crisscross the continent. By memorizing the song and the specific mythological story associated with a particular path, an individual can navigate thousands of miles of terrain.
The rhythm of the song matches the physical act of walking the landscape. The events in the story correspond to specific geological features.
The narrative tells you exactly where hidden water sources are located beneath the sand, where safe shelters are, and where the boundaries of hostile territories lie.
The physical landscape is literally encoded in the narrative structure. If you forget the story, you die of thirst. It is that stark.
So if we pull on this thread, we have to look at how this ancient system scales up. The songlines worked for indigenous networks, and the campfire stories worked for bands of 50 Agda hunter-gatherers.
But we don't live in small bands anymore. We live in sprawling, chaotic cities of millions of strangers.
To understand that leap, we look at the work of evolutionary anthropologist Robin Dunbar.
He pointed out that in primate societies, group cohesion is maintained through physical grooming. Monkeys literally pick bugs out of each other's fur.
Right, it lowers heart rates, releases endorphins, and establishes trust.
But physical grooming is incredibly time-consuming. As human groups began to expand beyond a certain size, roughly 150 individuals, which is known as Dunbar's number,
There simply wasn't enough time in the day to physically groom everyone to maintain social bonds. The group should have fractured.
so what replaced physical grooming? Language, specifically storytelling in the form of gossip.
Dunbar argues that gossip functioned as a kind of vocal grooming. I love the framing of gossip not as a toxic workplace habit, but as an essential survival technology.
It sounds trivial to modern ears, but tracking reputations is vital for large-scale survival.
Narratives about who in the tribe is a free rider, who is an honest trader, who is a reliable partner in a hunt.
And who is hoarding resources. This allowed individuals to form alliances with people they hadn't personally tested yet.
This reputation tracking mechanism allowed trust to scale, which enabled small bands to aggregate into larger and larger cooperative networks.
Historian Yuval Noah Harari builds on this exact premise, arguing that large-scale human cooperation, thousands or millions of strangers building a city or fighting a war together, depends entirely on shared imagined orders.
Right. Things like money corporations, human rights nations, they do not exist in objective physical reality.
You cannot point to a physical atom of a corporation. They only exist as collective narratives in our shared imagination.
As long as enough people believe the story of the US dollar, it functions as a reality.
But wait, this is where the research takes a distinctly darker turn.
Yeah, I was just going to say, if narrative transportation completely lowers our cognitive firewall and reduces our ability to counter-argue, and if our entire large-scale society relies on these unquestioned shared stories,
Isn't this basically a cognitive Trojan horse?
it absolutely is. And this vulnerability is why the research explicitly warns about how power structures and empires weaponize stories.
Remember, the human brain is highly constrained by metabolic limits. It despises messy ambiguity and complex multivariate problems.
It prefers coherence. It craves simple cause and effect relationships.
So empires and power structures use narratives to reduce incredibly complex political, historical, or economic realities into simple, easily digestible moral binaries. Good versus evil. Civilized versus savage.
The vanguard of progress versus the backward relics of the past. It's the ultimate bypass of critical resistance.
Right, if an empire simply announces to its citizens, we're going to violently subjugate this neighboring territory, extract their resources, and enrich our own ruling class.
The citizens' cognitive firewalls go up. They might rebel at the sheer brutality or the cost of the war.
But if the empire tells a story, we are the forces of light and civilization fundamentally destined to bring order to the chaotic, savage darkness of our neighbors.
The citizens' narrative engines accept the role. Their mirror neurons align with the hero archetype. It makes the brutal power dynamic seem not just acceptable, but natural, moral, and inevitable.
Precisely. As the sociological sources point out, empires weaponize story through three main avenues: legitimization, moral framing, and identity construction.
They don't just use stories to describe a reality, they use stories to define the very boundaries of what can even be imagined.
Systematically dismissing any alternative perspectives or competing narratives as irrational linearities or quite literally unthinkable.
Which brings us right to the threshold of our own modern world and our own modern minds.
We've established how this ancient technology built human cooperation, encoded life-saving ecological data, and can be weaponized to build empires.
So let's look at how this exact same neurobiological mechanism is actively shaping the three core pillars of our society right now.
Who we think we are, how we govern our communities, and how we learn.
Let's start with the most intimate application: identity formation. We culturally tend to think of ourselves as a static physical object.
We think of identity as a collection of fixed traits. I am introverted, I am analytical, I am a hard worker.
But narrative identity theory, pioneered by researchers like Dan McAdams, completely reframes this.
It shows that we don't just have a self. We actively construct a self.
We continuously organize the chaotic events of our past, the sensory input of our present, and our anxieties about the future into a coherent, overarching life story.
We're constantly writing ourselves as the protagonists of our own continuous internal novel.
And this is where the concept of archetypes becomes incredibly functional.
When people hear the word archetype, they often think of something mystical, tarot cards, crystal balls, or rigid personality quizzes.
But the cognitive research treats archetypes in a much more mechanical, practical way.
Archetypes like the caregiver, the exile, the trickster, the hero, the mentor, they are not mystical forces radiating from the cosmos. They're simply shorthand.
Because our brains rely heavily on symbolic compression, an archetype acts as a highly compressed cognitive file folder.
It represents recurring human roles, social tensions, and developmental stages that have existed for millennia.
An archetype helps us locate our individual confusing experiences within a shared, recognizable cultural pattern.
So if an archetype is just a compressed pattern of human experience, it's essentially an open-source piece of psychological software that anyone can download to make sense of a chaotic life event.
That's a great way to put it. I mean, if I go through a devastating breakup, or if I get fired from a job I loved, or if I move to a new city where I know no one...
The raw data of that experience is just overwhelming pain and confusion.
So if I can look at my life and say, I am currently entering the exile phase of my story. I have been pushed out of the kingdom, and now I have to wander the wilderness to discover my own strength.
Suddenly your suffering isn't just random, meaningless chaos. It has a structure. It has a narrative trajectory that implies an eventual return or resolution.
That is the exact functional utility of narrative identity. The psychological literature validates that using these archetypal structures helps organize traumatic or chaotic experiences, lowering anxiety and providing a sense of agency.
However, the research also issues a stern warning about this.
Yes, it does. Archetypes become dangerous, what one paper vividly describes as pseudoscientific mush, when they are detached from a broader community context.
If you use an archetype merely as a private, isolated fantasy label to convince yourself of your own unique exceptionalism,
Like saying, I am the misunderstood genius hero, and everyone else is just an obstacle.
yeah, well, misusing the tool, it leads to narcissism and alienation. Healthier identity formation is fundamentally dialogical.
It's about using those shared symbols to connect with others.
To realize that your specific pain is part of a universal human pattern, and to see how your individual thread weaves into the broader collective master narrative.
That connection between the individual narrative and the collective master narrative is the perfect bridge to discussing community infrastructure.
One of the sociological papers we reviewed, titled Beyond Infrastructure, makes an incredibly compelling argument about how we fundamentally misjudge the health of our cities and societies.
Right now, if you ask a politician or an economist to measure the health of a community, they will point to physical infrastructure.
They will measure housing density, the number of hospital beds, road maintenance, broadband access, and economic output.
But the sources argue that while housing and healthcare are absolutely necessary, they are vastly insufficient to keep a community from collapsing.
Drawing heavily on the work of sociologist Peter Berger, the research emphasizes that a human community requires a nomos.
A nomos.
Yes, a nomos is a shared system of meaning, a collective narrative that explains why the community exists and what its values are,
This nomos acts as a protective shield against enemy.
which is a state of deep normlessness, alienation, and social fragmentation.
Berger argues that if you provide a population with perfectly paved roads, state-of-the-art hospitals, and affordable housing, but you strip away their shared story, their rituals, and their sense of belonging or role clarity.
That community will inevitably fracture. People will succumb to despair, addiction, or radicalization.
Belonging, shared narrative, and communal ritual are not just nice poetic add-ons for a thriving city. They are actual load-bearing infrastructure for human psychology.
Which directly indicts how we handle education and civic engagement.
Yes, if we are trying to engage students in a high school classroom or citizens at a local town hall, and we just throw abstract facts, statistics, and policy white papers at them, it completely fails to mobilize them.
It doesn't penetrate the cognitive firewall because it lacks that symbolic narrative engagement.
The research on youth civic inquiry perfectly illustrates this.
Studies show that teaching teenagers about the mechanics of government from a dry, paradigmatic textbook is largely ineffective at producing engaged citizens.
But when researchers take those same youth and engage them in fictional civic systems,
When they ask them to role play or rigorously simulate real-world alternatives, such as collaboratively designing a hypothetical commons-based governance model for a futuristic city.
the engagement skyrockets. They are forced to negotiate rules, allocate imaginary resources, and deal with simulated crises.
This expands what researchers call their civic imagination.
Civic imagination. Because you cannot physically build a better political or social system in reality if you haven't first simulated it in your mind.
The fictional system acts as the social flight simulator for democracy. They get to practice the messy art of governance without the real-world consequences of failure.
Exactly. And this deep biological need for narrative coherence becomes most violently apparent and most critical to understand when we look at the psychology of trauma.
Trauma, whether it is a single individual surviving an accident or an entire community surviving a natural disaster or conflict, is fundamentally a shattering of narrative.
We looked deeply into Dr. Bessel van der Kolk's seminal work on trauma and the physical mechanisms of nervous system repair.
When an individual experiences overwhelming trauma, the brain's memory systems actually fragment.
The hippocampus, which sequences memories, chronologically goes offline, while the amygdala, the threat detection center, goes into overdrive.
The result is that the traumatic memory isn't stored as a story with a beginning, middle, and end. It's stored as raw, unintegrated sensory fragments, a smell, a sound, a flash of panic that intrude into the present.
The narrative timeline is destroyed. So how does a therapist or a community go about physically reweaving that broken timeline?
The crucial insight from the trauma research is that healing is not just a top-down cognitive process.
You cannot simply think your way out of it or logically rationalize the trauma away because the trauma is held in the dysregulated autonomic nervous system.
Repair requires bottom-up physiological regulation combined with narrative integration, and this often happens through rhythmic regulation and collective co-regulation.
What does rhythmic regulation actually look like in practice?
It looks like ancient shared rituals, drumming, chanting, synchronized breathing, or communal singing.
These practices provide predictable, low-frequency sensory input that directly stimulates the vagus nerve.
The vagus nerve then signals the amygdala that the environment is safe, bringing the body out of a chronic fight-or-flight state.
Once the physiological baseline is calmed through this physical rhythm, the community can begin the process of shared storytelling.
They can collectively verbalize what happened, assign meaning to the suffering, and reintegrate the fragmented memories into a coherent, manageable timeline.
Healing is profoundly a co-regulated social narrative process. You have to physically and narratively rebuild the nomos together.
The psychographic profiles in our market research sources highlight this exact human need, even outside the context of trauma.
Modern audiences, whether they are consumers buying a product, citizens voting for a policy, or students sitting in a lecture hall, do not want to just passively consume a polished myth handed down from an authority figure.
The data shows we desperately need to author our own identities,
We are looking for narrative frameworks that are sturdy enough to provide meaning, but open enough that we can actively project our own messy individual experiences onto them.
which serves as the perfect pivot from theory to application.
Yeah, if you are listening to this deep dive right now, you might be thinking this neurobiology and evolutionary history is fascinating. But how do I actually use this on Monday morning?
Whether you are a teacher designing a curriculum, a project manager trying to align a team, a city council member trying to pass a new zoning law, or simply someone trying to understand the chaotic trajectory of your own life.
Realizing that humans fundamentally require narrative coherence, not just facts, is the master key to unlocking human engagement.
So let's hand the keys directly over to you.
We are going to translate all of this brain science, all of the Agda hunter-gatherer data, and all the sociological theory into 3 concrete, highly actionable design rules that you can implement immediately.
Rule 1, design for narrative transportation, or as we like to say, show don't preach.
So bypassing the cognitive firewall.
The core concept underlying this rule is that modern audiences are highly skeptical, incredibly media literate, and deeply pluralistic. They are bombarded with thousands of persuasive messages every day.
If you stand in front of them in lecture, or if you just hand them a bulleted list of moral directives or corporate facts, their cognitive firewall instantly goes up.
They will actively counter-argue everything you say.
Instead, you must embed your core themes, your data, and your values into the very architecture of a narrative. Instead of telling them what to think, you have to let them experience the physical consequences of the data.
So how do we execute that practically in, say, a training module or a presentation?
You do it through rigorous cause-effect and character consequence. For pluralistic audiences who resist dogma, the research recommends a specific narrative technique called dialogism.
Dialogism. This means you intentionally build multiple competing viewpoints, unresolved questions, and genuine moral ambiguity directly into your narrative or your curriculum.
So instead of ending a module or a speech with a neat, tidy slide that says, and the moral of the story is X, therefore you must do Y,
You present a realistic scenario where 2 completely valid values clash.
you show a character making a difficult choice, and you show the unvarnished downstream consequences of that choice.
You don't preach the conclusion. You let the user or learner draw the conclusion themselves through experiential immersion. You let their own mirror neurons do the heavy lifting of persuasion.
Precisely. You make them feel the truth of the concept rather than just memorizing it, which leads directly to Rule 2.
Designing for symbolic compression. Use archetypes as scaffolding.
Stop overwhelming people with massive cognitive load. Remember the flag analogy from earlier?
We are constantly bombarding our employees, our students, and our citizens with endless streams of raw, uncompressed data.
And their basal ganglia, that velvet rope bouncer, is just ruthlessly filtering it all out as irrelevant noise.
The actionable step here is to intentionally use recognized symbolic patterns or archetypes to chunk complex ideas into manageable cognitive files.
If you are designing a curriculum, a product onboarding experience, or a training program, do not just give the learner a massive checklist of disconnected tasks. Give them a recognizable symbolic role to inhabit.
Right? If you are building a middle school science module about testing local water quality, Don't frame the syllabus as Module 4, learning the mechanics of pH balances and microbial testing.
That's abstract, it's paradigmatic thought.
Instead, you frame the entire module by putting the student in the archetype of the investigator or the detective.
Their mission is to solve a mysterious spike in illnesses in a hypothetical town by mastering the tools of chemistry.
Exactly. You provide a sturdy, symbolic container. It instantly reduces cognitive load because the student already intuitively understands how a detective behaves.
They look for clues, they run tests, they solve mysteries. You allow them to map their own agency onto that symbol.
But as we noted when discussing identity, you must ensure these symbols tie back to shared human realities and avoid rigid dogma.
The archetype should be a scaffold that supports exploration, not a cage that restricts their thinking.
That brings us to our final and perhaps most challenging directive. Rule 3. Build frameworks for co-authorship. Enable interactive meaning-making.
Because as we saw with the Agnes storytellers and the trauma repair research, raw data might inform an individual, but ritual and interaction are what actually bond a community together.
Consumers, learners, and citizens today possess a deep psychological need for agency. They don't want to sit in the dark and just listen to your polished story. They want to step onto the stage and enact their own.
The actionable step here is to design interactive systems rather than static broadcasts.
Depending on your field, this could be a guided psychological reflection, a role-playing civic game for city planning, or a physical recurring ritual in a classroom that requires student participation.
The crucial element is that the system must provide immediate narrative feedback based on the user's choices.
Let me push back on this a bit because co-authorship sounds great when we're talking about creative writing or trauma therapy, but what about environments with zero tolerance for ambiguity?
Like compliance.
Yes, let's apply Rule 3, something incredibly mundane and rigid, like standard corporate anti-bribery compliance training. If I'm designing that training, the company absolutely does not want the employee co-authoring their own truth about bribery.
Definitely not.
They don't want interactive meaning-making. They want the employee to know unequivocally that if they bribe a foreign official, they go to federal prison. Isn't a strict, non-interactive, terrifying boundary much better there than a nuanced story?
It is a valid challenge, but it fundamentally misunderstands how the brain processes risk.
How so?
If you just show them a slide that says bribery equals prison, their eyes glaze over. It's abstract. It doesn't activate the amygdala.
So they forget it.
Right. If we apply the science of the social flight simulator to compliance training, we completely throw out the passive multiple choice slideshow. Instead, we create a high-fidelity simulation.
We place the employee in a realistically ambiguous scenario.
Perhaps a late-night negotiation with a crucial client where the client subtly hints that a small consulting fee to a third party would expedite the contract.
The employee has to make a choice. But instead of just popping up a generic red screen that says incorrect violation of policy 4B, the system actually simulates the terrifying narrative consequences of that choice.
You show them the downstream domino effect?
Exactly, the simulation branches. You show the short-term win of getting the contract, followed by the agonizing slow burn paranoia as internal audits begin.
You show the tense meetings with the corporate legal team. You simulate the exact email they would receive from the DOJ.
You activate their agent-based cause and effect narrative reasoning.
You completely shift the neural activation from passive abstract reading, which is forgotten 5 minutes after the quiz, to active stressful simulation.
You give them a framework to build a resilient, ethical, professional identity through trial and error in a safe space, rather than just forcing them to memorize a legal code.
We have covered an absolute mountain of ground today, and it completely reframes how we should view our daily interactions.
We started by looking deep under the hood of the human brain, discovering how reading a simple story literally lights up our motor cortex and our mirror neuron systems.
Acting as a low-risk social flight simulator that allows us to practice surviving complex social dynamics.
We traveled back to the act of hunter-gatherers to see how storytellers were biologically rewarded because they provided the vital social glue that ensured human cooperation.
And we saw how the Aboriginal songlines encoded life-saving geographic data into musical cartography.
We explored how this ancient cognitive hack shapes our modern narrative identity, how it functions as load-bearing infrastructure to protect our cities from enemy,
And how it helps heal the traumatized nervous system through rhythmic collective regulation.
And we translated all of that deep science into 3 functional rules for the modern world.
Bypass the cognitive firewall by managing skepticism through cause and effect simulation.
Designed for symbolic compression by using archetypes to reduce cognitive load and provide structure.
and build frameworks for co-authorship so your audience can actively enact and negotiate meaning rather than passively consuming data.
So what does this all mean for you, whether you are managing a global team, raising a child, designing a new software product, or just trying to navigate your own complicated life?
It means you have scientific permission to stop just handing out spreadsheets and raw data. You need to start building worlds.
Realize that the people around you are not perfectly logical machines. They are deeply emotional, narrative-driven creatures starving for coherence.
But I want to leave you with a final, slightly provocative thought to mull over, one that takes the implications of this research to its logical extreme.
We've spent this entire deep dive celebrating how essential stories are for survival, how they create beautiful societal coherence, and how our brains so desperately crave them.
But consider the dark flip side of that biological imperative. Because our basal ganglia so desperately craves narrative simplicity,
Because we are addicted to clear cause and effect, to recognizable hero and villain archetypes, to neat, satisfying resolutions,
we systematically reject complex truths that refuse to fit into a neat story arc.
the ultimate cognitive Trojan horse.
Exactly. Reality is very rarely a neat story. Ecological collapse, systemic economic shifts, slow-moving pandemics. These are massively complex, multivariate, deeply unnarrative problems.
There is often no single villain to defeat, no single hero to save us, and no guaranteed satisfying resolution.
Think about your own life, the organization you work for, or the political ideology you subscribe to. What is a perfectly coherent, highly engaging, emotionally satisfying story you currently believe that might actually be erasing a much more complex, messy, and uncomfortable reality?
If storytelling is our species' greatest evolutionary survival tool, could our biological addiction to a good story eventually be the very blind spot that causes our real-world collapse?
We started this hour by imagining you as an engineer, realizing that human behavior isn't driven by the clean X-ray clarity of pure logic, but by the messy, emotional, incredibly powerful engine of hallucinated fictions.
The question you have to ask yourself now is, what kind of fictions are you going to choose to run on?
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the narratives around you.